Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Theresa May arrived in Canada this morning for the start of the G7 summit, but while she was in the air, another major row had broken out following the explosive leak of a tape recording her Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson making some pretty unguarded comments at a dinner earlier this week. Well, Lizzie Glinker is here to take us through it all. Now, Lizzie, he's not exactly a stranger, Boris Johnson, to controversial public declarations.
Indeed not.
How did this all happen?
Well, this was, as you say, at a kind of posh private dinner on Wednesday night, a group called Conservative Way Forward. They're having dinner, imagine, nice meal, few drinks, and then the Foreign Secretary went to have a kind of private Q&A with around 20 of these activists and supporters. And they were doing that under something called Chatham House rules, which is the kind of academic or political equivalent to what goes on tour stays on tour, which allows people to kind of speak freely and there's no fear that it's going to go any further. Well, clearly, in this situation, someone was not abiding by those rules and they recorded it and it's been released. Now, in a room full of people who are all kind of like-minded individuals, who could have done such a thing? We don't know, but nevertheless, it is very interesting.
Yes, and what exactly did he say?
Oh, there's lots of juicy bits. Lots of juicy bits. So should we have a look at some of them? We're not going to play all of the clips.
No, because we'll be here for about 2 hours.
And it's recorded on a mobile phone, so some of it is quite crackly. But, you know, here we go. First up, you've got to face the fact there may be a meltdown. OK? I don't want anybody to panic during this meltdown. No panic. Pro bono publico, no bloody panic. It's going to be all right in the end.
He loves a bit of Latin, doesn't he?
That's me channeling my best Boris Johnson there. So, yes, he loves a bit of Latin. This quote refers back to the last time we were all in uproar about Europe in the 1970s. It was a speech given to Conservative MPs. But at least gives you the sense, at least, that the Foreign Secretary thinks there is going to be a meltdown. You know, something a little bit that might worry the Prime Minister, one would imagine, in a week that has already not been particularly good.
And then he takes aim at Whitehall?
He does, indeed, very specifically at the Treasury, a bit of a swipe at Philip Hammond. We have the Treasury is basically the heart of Remain. And then he goes on to say they don't want any disruption of the economy, so they're sacrificing all the medium and long-term gains out of fear of short-term disruption. So on the one hand, admitting that there is going to be disruption, and on the other hand, saying some people in government clearly don't have the will to push this through and perhaps the strength of character. Who could he be referring to? We don't know. But yes, he goes on equally bullish on Northern Ireland. He refers to it as folly, says this issue is so small. There are so few firms that actually use this border regularly. It's just beyond belief that we're allowing the tail to wag the dog in this way.
What do you think, Isabel? What did you think when you first heard it?
I thought it was absolutely delicious. I mean, journalists just live for these stories. We absolutely love it when stuff like this gets leaked. On a serious note, look, Boris Johnson is an extremely experienced politician. He must have known that there was a very good chance that this would have been leaked. I don't know how much of a good dinner he had had at the point at which he spoke.
How much wine was consumed?
But I think he must have known there was a possibility, probably a probability, it would get out there. And what this does is it speaks to the incredible level of nerves amongst Brexiteer MPs at the moment. I think possibly those nerves are not entirely founded. I think Downing Street privately is very reassuring about what the state of things are. There's a lot of rhetoric going on here. Downing Street is very anxious not to wind up either the Remain MPs on their own backbenches or the European Commission.
All right. Before I come to you, Afua, for your response when you heard the comments from Boris Johnson, he did also talk about Donald Trump.
He did, indeed. It was almost a call to chaos, which is quite remarkable, really, in praise of sort of Trumpian diplomacy. And I think we can actually hear that clip now.
Imagine Trump doing Brexit. What would he do? He'd go in bloody hard. You know, he'd do all sorts of breakdowns. There'd be all sorts of chaos. Everyone would think he'd gone mad. But actually, you might get some. So it's a very, very good call.
Alpha, what do you think of that? The idea that actually Theresa May just isn't being tough enough and Trump might do a better job?
I think that Boris has worked out that the ship is sinking and he's hedging his bets to get off it. And it reminds me of the columns he wrote when he was working out his position in whether he was going to be Brexit or Remain. And one of the Remain column got leaked, and he published the Brexit one, kind of showing. And this is how he functions. He likes to be on the right side. He wants to be on the side of the popular cause. And I think that he perceives that this isn't going well, and he wants to be disassociated with it. At the same time, he's kind of, as he does, saying these just making bravado statements about Trumpian. I mean, who could he be referring to when he says someone more like Trump? Who is the politician in the UK that gets compared to Trump? And underneath everything Boris does, there is always this sense that he's making his own little bid to set himself up for the leadership at some point. And it's a very clever strategy because it's so audacious that he somehow survives it. Where it's a bit less crazy, you feel like he would go, but he kind of goes so far.
Do you see it like that? Do you think it's a sort of, I'm putting myself forward again, if the ball were ever to come loose from it?
Look, it's always a bit about Boris, isn't it? And I think as a Brexiteer, I too love the idea of someone going in Trump style and kind of ripping everything up and saying, take it or leave it. You can either have our way or it's the highway. But I don't know if that methodology works with the EU. They are very process-driven. It's not the way necessarily to get the result.
And just finally, Lizzie, there has been a response, hasn't there, from Team Boris?
Of sorts, yes. As we said, we don't know where this came from, but indeed, as Bill said, it may do him no harm whatsoever. But his response from his friends is to say that he is sad and disappointed that he was recorded in this way and it has become public in this manner. We've not had any response from Number 10 yet, of course, Prime Minister over in Canada for the G7. So, yes, that's sort of where we are.
I can hear the violins in Team Boris. Lizzie, thanks for taking us through it. Well, let's talk now to the Brexit-supporting Conservative MP, Peter Bone, who is in Cambridge. Peter, what did you think? When you heard those comments, did you have your head in your hands? Did your jaw drop with shock? Or did you punch the air with joy?
Oh, I punched the air with joy. Boris was saying what people think, and it's outrageous if you're on Chatham House rules that you're recorded like that. I mean, it's the sort of thing I can say from the back benches, but he's confined by being collective responsibility, and somebody's sort of let the cat out of the bag. But there was nothing he said that I think most people will be surprised about or disagreed with.
So you agree with everything he said, don't you? Really, everything from the swipe at Philip Hammond and the Treasury being the heart of Remain.
I think it was a swipe at the Treasury, which is pretty much the heart of Remain. There's a lot of heart of Remain in the officials in Number 10 Downing Street. And the problem is we're being held back by Remain officials who are driving this thing. And when he says we should have someone like Donald Trump leading negotiations, well, he could have said Mrs Thatcher, couldn't he? And you understand where he's coming from on that point of view.
Right. Would you like to see someone like Trump or, a sort of Trumpian response to the Brexit negotiations? Yeah,
I think what I'd like to see is Theresa May fire all the spads and officials and civil servants for making the whole Brexit negotiations impossible and give David Davis an absolute free hand to go and negotiate. That's what we need. We want someone who believes in Brexit heading the negotiation, not some officials doing it because they're told to do it and are trying to put obstacles in the way.
Does Theresa May, in your mind, still believe in Brexit?
Well, clearly, I mean, all the things Theresa May has said about the red lines, I totally support. But if everyone around her is delaying what she wants to do, then the answer is to get rid of those people and hand the whole negotiations back to somebody who clearly believes in it, like David Davis, and stop all this shilly-shallying.
Right. I mean, you described her as the Queen of Brexit. You wanted to erect a statue in Wellingborough, carry her through the streets of Wellingborough. Do you still think and see her in that role?
If we deliver a proper Brexit, and her problem isn't that she doesn't believe in that. It isn't that it's not Liam Fox or David Davis or Boris. It's the people around her who are stopping it, and they really do have to go. And my message to the Prime Minister: the best thing you could do is get rid of those people, put someone in charge who believes it. And,
right. Do you think you might have to delay erecting that statue in her honour as the Queen of Brexit? Is there a risk of Britain being tied in perpetuity to the EU?
Yes, of course. The backstop arrangements that was published yesterday, there is no end date to when we would stay in the customs union. It's totally unacceptable and needs to be rejected.
So David Davis lost that battle. Why is he still in the government?
Well, hang on a minute. We don't know who lost what battle, but I want more Brexiteers in government, not less. So I don't want any Brexiteers resigning. I want. If anybody wants to leave the government as a Remainer who doesn't believe in Brexit, fine, and let's replace them with a Brexiteer. We certainly don't want to lose Brexiteers from the government.
Do you think it was unwise for him to threaten? And we know this because he seemed to tell through his advisers enough journalists that he would walk if there wasn't some sort of time limit put on the extension of being closely tied to the EU. And now all he's got, it seems, is an expected end date of December 2021. No cast iron guarantee.
Well, you're certainly right that it's only an expected date and therefore it's totally unacceptable. It would be unacceptable to me to extend anything past the transition period anyway. But I have no idea about resignation. You're far better informed on that than me.
Right, but I mean, even worth threatening if you then end up staying, despite the fact that he hasn't got a cast iron guarantee on the suspected end date. I mean, it loses its potency, doesn't it?
Well, what I want is Brexiteers in government driving the whole policy, and I've said that already, and I think that's what Mrs May needs to do. She needs to give David Davis the power to implement the Brexit that he believes in. That, if she announced that today, that would be a very good way of celebrating the anniversary of the general election.
Right. I mean, is there a risk of Brexit meltdown amongst you and your colleagues?
Just explain what you mean by meltdown.
Well, I am using Boris Johnson's phrase, so I'm using it in the way I, translate the word meltdown. Collapse. Are you all going to have a meltdown if you don't get what you want in Brexit?
Well, what we've got to do is deliver what the British people want. And, of course, if we weren't going to do that, then there would be a meltdown. But Theresa May's committed to delivering that. If you meant the European Union rejecting what we want, that's quite likely. That would be a meltdown. And then I think we should come out of the EU on the global world trade rules. And I think we should I probably think we've got to a stage now where we say to the European Union, enough of these phony negotiations. We're coming out at the end of March next year. We'll end the free movement of people. We'll save £39 billion straight away. We'll regain our fishing rights. We'll make our own laws in our own country. We'll make our own trade deals. Those are pretty attractive things. And I think that's something that, with clarity, if we said that now, we could prepare for. After
listening to Peter Bone there, do you think he's going to be disappointed by Theresa May or not?
Of course he's going to be disappointed, because that whole worldview, which, by the way, I mean, it's quite compelling on one level, the idea of all these evil civil servants trying to subvert the democratic process. That's not the reason this is happening. There are two reasons this is happening. One is that there was no clear mandate from the British people as to what they wanted in Brexit. The words EFTA and EEA and single market and customs union were not being debated.
Single market and customs union were used.
Well, but if you ask most people what they were voting for, they did not have a sophisticated roadmap as far as those arrangements are concerned, and neither did the politicians campaigning on both sides. And the second reason I think that it's proving very difficult, rather than evil civil servants, is because it's much more complicated than anyone envisaged, that they had not thought through the implications for Northern Ireland. And contrary to Boris Johnson kind of dismissing that as the tail wagging the dog, which I think is incredibly offensive to one of the nations of the UK, these are actually issues that really matter.
Well, I don't think that people needed a sophisticated roadmap when they decided whether or not we wanted sovereignty or control over immigration. These are quite simple questions, yes or no.
But
that's what they were asked,
simple,
and the result is
now?
We do want that.
And how do you achieve that?
Well, you certainly don't achieve that by retaining free movement of people, by remaining in the single market. You certainly don't achieve sovereignty by remaining shackled to the EU. These are actually quite simple questions. Getting out is difficult, it is complicated, but it doesn't change the fundamental result of the referendum.
Right, can I just put, Peter Bone, before you go, wasn't it incredibly disloyal of Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary to Theresa May, someone you see as the Queen of Brexit, to say the sorts of things that he did? It was a private-ish dinner. He knows what it's like. He knows the lay of the land, that there's always a likelihood it's going to be leaked. And he said the Prime Minister lacked guts, basically, in her Brexit negotiations, that someone more Trumpian would be better. Isn't that disloyal?
Well, first of all, it was a Chatham House rules.
Yeah, but that's not my question. Was it disloyal to say that even in Chatham House rules?
I'm sure that when you go off the air, you say things that wouldn't necessarily.
But I'm not an elected politician. I'm not the Foreign Secretary.
No, but you're a very important part of the
yes,
BBC
Peter,
media.
never mind the flattery. What about his disloyalty? I mean, is
No,
it
it's
really,
not disloyal.
really...
I mean, what he said was, I'm absolute with Boris on the sentiments of what he said. The Prime Minister probably agrees with him as well.
But
I
was
mean,
it
I'm sorry.
disloyal? Was it disloyal to undermine his own Prime Minister in that way, Peter Bone?
Well, it's not undermining it. No, which bit was undermining it? Was it the fact that he was saying the heart of resistance was in the Treasury? Well, how does that undermine the Prime Minister?
Well, saying that the Brexit negotiation lack guts, is that a compliment to the Prime Minister in the way she's handled it?
Isn't that the point I just mentioned, that the civil servants are doing these negotiations are not believers in Brexit and do in that regard lack guts? I don't think any of that is aimed at the Prime Minister, but there's certainly a lot of truth in what Boris said, and well done, Boris.
On that note, Peter Bone, thank you. Now, let's head over to Brussels, because in the next hour, the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, is due to hold a press conference. Yesterday, after much wrangling here in Westminster, the government did submit its proposal for the backstop on Northern Ireland. Adam Fleming, who else is there for us? Now, Adam, yesterday you sort of set out a list of questions that Michel Barnier and the EU might have, but you did think that they would engage, at least, on the proposals being put forward by the UK.
I suppose what happens next is whether this backstop proposal from the UK published yesterday is rejected outright, or whether it forms a basis for discussion and actually the EU has questions about it rather than just saying it's never going to work. I have to say, from talking to officials from the 27 remaining member states in the bars of Brussels last night, the response was not overwhelmingly positive. They're quite concerned about this issue about, is it temporary or does it have a time limit? Or is it designed to look like it's temporary and has a time limit but doesn't really? There's another paragraph in the backstop proposal that talks about the UK having effectively a seat at the table when the EU negotiates future trade deals, when the UK is no longer here but is involved with the backstop. They're worried about what kind of system they will have to construct to make that happen. And they're also worried that fundamentally, could this backstop end up being a sort of back door for the UK to get privileged access to the single market via Northern Ireland and Ireland, but without the obligations that would apply to it if it's a member state? So they've got some big things they want to find out about it. And I chased after Michel Barnier in the corridors of the European Parliament yesterday when he was doing an event.
You're always
chasing
after him.
He kind of gave the game away. You know me, I can't resist. When I see him walking down the corridor, I head straight for him. But he kind of gave the game away, saying that this will be a matter for the European Council. In other words, the decision about whether this is a goer will belong to EU leaders when they meet for a summit in 3 weeks here in Brussels.
Right,
rather
well,
than him.
Right, that's interesting, isn't it? Because there has been plenty of talk here that actually that's what the government would like, is to go over the heads of the Commission, this rigid mandate that Michel Barnier has, and talk to Council leaders. Do you think that's the way things are moving?
The fact is, Michel Barnier, his focus at the moment is on getting the Brexit treaty, the withdrawal agreement, that 120-page document, which some of it is coloured in green because the UK and the EU agree. He wants the rest of the 25% coloured in green. Now, part of that 25% includes the backstop, so he's focusing on getting a version of the backstop that's palatable to both sides. He's also focusing on the other remaining issues which get less attention, like the governance of the agreement, how do you solve disputes, but also things like geographical indications, like feta can only come from Greece, cava can only come from Spain, Cornish pasties can only come from Cornwall. They've still got to sort that stuff out, and they've still got to sort out loads of other non-sexy issues, like how do you deal with ongoing police operations and court cases and data protection that's happening at the point of Brexit. So his focus, everything he does, is about getting that agreement in place. So the advice he gives EU leaders and how they behave is all about getting that done. Their focus is on that rather than the future relationship at the moment, and I think it's very important to just keep that in mind when we listen and interpret everything that he says in the next 45 minutes.
Right, well, Adam, we'll let you go into that press conference, which will be starting, as you say, in about 40 minutes or so, and we will catch up with you, no doubt, next week. Now, let's bring the focus back here. It's a busy day, as always, because the pro-Remain group, Best for Britain, has officially launched its campaign for a second second referendum on Brexit. The group, which has raised £2.3 million and is partly backed by the billionaire George Soros, argues for a second poll in less than 3 years to finally settle the question of the UK's membership of the EU. And the group's chairman, Mark Malloch-Brown, is here in the studio. Welcome. How has support, what's the evidence for support growing for a people's vote, as you call it?
Well, I mean, it is growing. The polling shows, a steady movement in that direction. But I'd be the first to say, not yet a decisive movement, just as there isn't a decisive movement in favour of remaining rather than leaving. I think what has changed, though, is this sort of political chaos at Westminster, which has deepened and is starting to cut through to people. Hell, if we leave it to the politicians, they are never going to sort this. They can't even agree in cabinet, let alone in government or in Westminster. So Monsieur Barnier sits and waits, and there really is no proposals brought to him. So what we're suggesting is that, and we hope it's as appealing to leavers as it is to remainers, is come on, we can't live with this indecision. It's killing us.
Right, but what gives you the right, Mark Malloch-Brown? As you say, there's been no massive shift in the polls, and you say there's a bit more support for a people's vote. Why should you impose your will on what you think is right because you think there is political chaos?
I don't think I'm going to be able to impose anything.
But you are trying to, aren't you?
No. We're making an appeal, a democratic argument, both to Parliament and the people, to say this impasse is destroying us as a country, destroying us.
Why is it being destroyed? What's been destroyed?
Well, that we're 2 years in and no clearer than the day of the vote. In fact, a lot less clear on what Brexit would look like. And, I'm an old foreign policy guy, so I talk to people all over the world and, they just shake their heads in despair. Stable, secure, loyal Britain is gone. Right. And so, look, I think, but whether it's me or a car worker in Sunderland worried about his job, the fact that we have no clarity is key. So what are we proposing? That Parliament actually cuts Mrs May some slack so she can go to Brussels and actually negotiate a deal and bring it back and present it to Parliament and then to the people in a second referendum, so that by March 2019, the nightmare one way or another is over. Leave or stay.
But what you want is for Britain to stay and for Britain to remain, and that's the point of this vote, is that by talking up what you see as chaos and a country being destroyed, although I've yet to see evidence of it being destroyed, will persuade enough people to reverse Brexit.
Well, look, I'm not the only one talking up the chaos. I mean, Boris Johnson and I could have swapped words. I mean, there's clearly two things Boris Johnson share in common. After dinner speeches are very dangerous things. And second, this process is failing. And so, I think, and you had Peter Bone on who was saying much the same thing. So I don't think I've got any monopoly on this idea that we've got to find a way out of the impasse we're in.
Except what was decisive in many people's minds was that vote to leave. 17.4 million people voted to leave. They won that referendum. And a number of MPs on this programme have said if there were to be a reversal, if the UK didn't leave the EU, it would have serious consequences. I mean, they've even almost sort of hinted at unrest may be too strong a word, but I mean, are you prepared to take that risk?
Look, I've in the lobbies of the Lords had people whisper in my ear as we walk in opposite directions, you're going to create insurrection in the streets. But it's again why we are putting it back to the people. We're not suggesting the Lords or the Commons.
This is the most appalling piece of spin, I have to say. This whole thing about the people's vote, it's like the people's princess, Princess Diana. What utter schmaltz this is. The people's vote was just a vote. It was the referendum. In what way was that not a people's vote? We've had it. People voted to leave. And what I don't understand about the rationale for a second referendum is what gives you the expectation that the outcome would be any more decisive. It's entirely possible that it would be just as marginal one way or another. And then where would we be? Would you want a third one?
The whole point is to create a means of securing a decisive outcome.
Why would it secure a decisive outcome? Very likely it would just be as narrow.
Well, welcome to the world of Brexit, where everybody talks over each other, nobody listens to the other side.
It's not just over Brexit, I can assure you.
Well, I think rather heavily in Brexit more than anything else, let me put it this way, because, it has completely hijacked our politics. It's hijacked the civility of British politics as much as the content content. And what we are trying to say is that this time, rather than Project Fear versus lies on the side of buses, we hope to arrive at a point where Mrs May's deal can be interrogated by ordinary Britons. They can work out, is this better than where we are now? Should we go down this road? And I think, you know, democracy in that sense allows people, you know, a second decision. I mean, would we in 2015, having elected a Tory government, conclude that's the end of democratic politics? We don't need any more elections?
But referendums are different, aren't they, in that sense? I mean, well, Afua, can I just bring you in here listening to the passion, I suppose, behind Mark Mallet-Brown and what he's saying, and he's despairing over what's going on at the moment. But do you think that's actually going to change, move the dial in the way Isabella said that actually if we did have another vote, not
well,
much
I
would
wonder
change?
what Brexiteers are so afraid of, if they're that confident that the will of the people is to leave, why they think a second referendum would be so
afraid. I think there could be actually a bigger vote for leave. I don't think we're afraid.
In which case it would be the decisive. Well, the thing is, the misery is being strung out, and it does strike me that listening to Mark, listening to Boris, listening to Mark, the diagnoses are the same. It's kind of catastrophic at the moment, and the solutions offered are different. One is to kind of sack everyone and have a Trumpian leader kind of see it through like a bulldozer. The other option is to bring in the will of the people that everyone is always talking about, saying that this is ultimately about sovereignty and about democratic will, and to have Parliament have a meaningful vote on and with a genuine set of options on the table. It's almost like what should have happened the first time around had we not all been in La La Land. And I say that because both sides were not presenting an honest picture as to what would be involved.
I mean, in terms of your thoughts now at this point, you need the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, or it would be enormously helpful if they were to come out and say, yes, let's have that second vote, yes, let's remain in the European Economic Area. Are you in discussions with Jeremy Corbyn and his team, and are they going to do that in the end? We
reach out to all parts of the Labour Party, very much including its leadership, and we've been absolutely explicit and clear that both front benches are failing the country. The government front bench because it can't get to a deal.
Do you think
the
they'll come
Labour
round to
one
your
because
position?
it should be opposing, it should be doing the job of a real opposition, which is, you know, interrogating the government on the great decision of the day.
Do you think they'll shift? Do you think they're about to shift?
I think they will. Look, 75% of Labour voters voted Remain. I think whether they shift out of principle or tactical opportunity, I think the direction of their travel is clear.
Mark Mallet-Brown, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, let's return to our main story, the fallout from the leaked tape of Boris Johnson and the government's Brexit policy. Here's what former Conservative leader Michael Howard had to say on the Today programme this morning.
He's certainly right to say we shouldn't panic. I don't know about a meltdown. I'm not as close to the negotiations as Boris is. But there were always, as I say, going to be thrills and spills. And what we have to do is to focus on the essentials of the situation. The essentials are that the European Union wants a deal, and there is every prospect, therefore, if we hold our nerve, that we can get a good deal for them and a good deal for us, because it's in our mutual interest that that should happen.
Okay. Michael Howard on the Today programme. He was on the Leave side of the argument. And joining us here in the studio, his fellow Conservative peer, Ros Altman, who was and still is, I believe, a Remainer. What did you think when you heard Boris Johnson?
I must admit, I was absolutely flabbergasted. Number one, that he was taped saying these kind of things. And number two, that he was playing down things like the Irish border. You know, this is one country in our United Kingdom. We have signed up to an international agreement to protect that border, and to suggest that it doesn't matter, or it's a tiny little pinprick and no one should actually take much notice of it. For the Conservative and Unionist Party, I was actually quite astonished. But also for him to suggest that, oh, we shouldn't panic if things are pretty disastrous at the beginning, because sometime in the future, we no idea when, maybe things will be okay. It struck me a bit like, you know, Corporal Jones from Dad's Army, don't panic. Actually, if we carry on with leaving the customs union and single market, it is a disaster for our country and our business. And it won't be just a small problem. And this isn't Project Fear, this is businesses saying it increasingly, and lots of Tory colleagues are very worried. We don't have to
right,
Brexit.
But who is actually closer to government policy on this? Boris Johnson with his views expressed and leaked last night, or yours? Yours are not in line with government policy, are they?
My sense is that Boris is not getting his way within government, and so he is trying to force the hand outside. I think the Prime Minister recognises that we probably need to soften our stance. Going in hard and threatening Europe hasn't worked, it won't work, it misunderstands Europe. You need to go in with your hand round the shoulder and say, we want to be your partners, we want to be your friends, let's talk about it and work it out.
Right, well, Isabel, Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, has apparently, in an interview or made comments in a speech where he has said a Trumpian style of leading the Brexit negotiations would not get better results.
And I think Downing Street are very clear about that, because they have learnt by dealing with the EU, one of the reasons we want to get out, by the way, is that they are incredibly process-led. It's a very kind of Germanic way of dealing with things. It doesn't work to go in there all guns blazing. So Brexiteers need to keep the faith. I do find it surprising to hear you sitting there saying it's all going to be a disaster. I just don't see what your evidence is for this.
The government's own figures. All the analysis that the government has done...
Because those figures have proven so accurate in the past, haven't they?
No, I'm talking about the most recent figures,
warnings.
and I'm talking about hard Brexit. I'm not talking about Brexit. Brexit, you know, doesn't mean coming out of the single market and the customs union.
Well, it does for the government. I mean, if you're basing it on what your government
and your
is
manifestos,
saying, do you think then the figures are still stacking up the way you say?
If you look at the manifesto, it does not say we have to leave the customs union. It says we want to have a close customs relationship. It's not the European customs union, it's a different style, but we have to keep closely related and take some of the regulations. Otherwise, Northern Ireland doesn't work, integrated supply chains don't work, and you've got a lot of jobs depending on that. And if you look at the no-deal scenario, which is where we would head if we are not going to actually have proper negotiations with the EU, and which some of the colleagues seem to want, but I don't think the Prime Minister does, then you would be talking disaster. We don't need to be. We could stay close.
How do you think
Brexit.
the Prime Minister should deal with Boris Johnson?
That's a very difficult one, and I don't envy her position. She is in a really tough spot because we want to keep the party together. We don't want Boris being a loose cannon outside government, although I must say I am astonished at some of the lack of accountability and unity being publicly shared. You know, these things should be going on behind closed doors, and if you lose the argument within the cabinet, I don't think it's right to then go out and try and use the media to get your messages
Should
through.
she show leadership, Theresa May, and deal with Boris Johnson and even David Davis?
It could be that she is playing a much cleverer game and trying to let everybody try and work their ways through. She's already helped them see that the Max Fac or the customs arrangements they said would be easy and simple are not going to work. We're now hearing, well, maybe they won't work and maybe it'll be very difficult at the beginning. So she's helping them to come on that journey.
Right.
Well, I can't pretend to know what's going on inside the Prime Minister's head, but it's quite obvious to me that allowing this to play itself out so publicly is damaging everybody's confidence in Brexit, both on the Leave and the Remain side. Nobody wants this nation to tank. And, you know, it doesn't inspire confidence that there is control over this process, that we have a plan. And, you know, that's being played out internationally as well as domestically. It's very
I think
damaging.
what you were really asking when you're saying how should the Prime Minister deal with Boris Johnson and David Davis is should she fire them?
That's right.
Look, make no mistake, she is in no position to do that. Her position is far too fragile. I mean, as we understand it, there are very near 48 letters in the safe of the chairman of the 1922 committee ready for a leadership challenge. So she can't do that. What she needs to do and what she is doing is focus on getting these negotiations through. And as for stuff recorded in Chatham House speeches, well, she just needs to let that be noises off.
Would you like
That's
to see
what
him
she's
sacked?
doing. I wouldn't like to see anybody sacked. I'd like to see us all working together to make this work for the country.
In harmony. Ross Altman, thank you.
We're leaving Washington, taking you to Brussels. This is the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, responding to UK proposals on that backstop we've been telling you about.
As a backstop, since the issue of full regulatory alignment is not addressed. I repeat that we need regulatory alignment to avoid a hard border. How do we solve this issue? Second question, does the UK proposal respect the integrity of the single market and the customs union? The UK wants to continue benefiting from our free trade agreements. Does that mean that we will have to reopen, renegotiate, or even re-ratify our existing agreements in order to keep the UK in our customs territory after the transition? The UK tells us that it wants to avoid any control. How does that fit with the requirements of our VAT system? Third set of questions, is it an all-weather backstop? The UK calls this arrangement temporary. How does that fit with the need to secure the absence of a hard border in all circumstances? Moreover, we had agreed with the UK on the principle that public authorities and businesses would need to adapt only once to the new situation created by Brexit. Only once. Does the temporary nature of the customs arrangements mean that several adaptations will now be needed? Ladies and gentlemen, these questions require further discussion. The UK itself recognizes that these questions are relevant and difficult. Let me recall that our backstop in this document provides answer to each of these questions. It provides specific solutions to the unique situation of Northern Ireland. The UK is taking a different angle, however. It is looking for a UK-wide solution. Let me be clear, very clear. Our backstop cannot be extended to the whole UK. Why? Because it had been designed for the specific situation of Northern Ireland. What does it do? On customs, Northern Ireland would form part of our customs territory. What is feasible with a territory the size of Northern Ireland is not necessarily feasible with the whole UK. On regulatory alignment, we have been pragmatic and developed the least disruptive system for citizens and businesses on both sides. Let's go to pragmatism. Checks carried out on ferries are less disruptive than along 500 kilometers long land border. In addition, these checks can build on arrangements and facilities which already exist between the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland. Obviously, behind all these rules, we want to preserve the fluidity and ease of trade and agriculture production on the island of Ireland. And once again, we need such a solution in the withdrawal agreement by autumn. We will not leave this issue unresolved. Mesdames et Messieurs, mon troisième et dernier point concerne
my third and final point
précisément cette relation
relates to that very point, our future relationship with the United Kingdom. In line with the mandate that I received from the European Council in March, and in line with the wishes expressed by the European Parliament in its resolution, we are now in the process of discussing the framework of this new relationship, which will comprise an economic partnership and strategic cooperation on security matters. Up until now, in all the British papers that we've received, and I do read them very carefully with my team, there is a request for a status quo, a request for continuity, which is somewhat paradoxical when the country took the decision to leave the European Union. The European Union, therefore, seems to want to keep all the benefits of the existing relationship whilst leaving our regulatory, common supervisory and implementation framework. When we tell our British counterparts that these benefits are not accessible outside the system created by the European Union, and that this is the result of their own decision, some parties in the United Kingdom try to make us responsible for the consequences of that decision. Let me say the following. We're not going to be intimidated. We're not going to be intimidated by this form of blame game. The European Union has decided, the United Kingdom has decided to leave the European Union. We respect that democratic decision and we are implementing it, and the United Kingdom has to accept the consequences. And if we want to build a new relationship, there needs to be more trust, but there also needs to be more realism about what's possible and what is not possible. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 working weeks left before the European Council at the end of June, and I hope we'll put them to good use to consolidate progress and make further progress in these difficult, complex negotiations. I'm happy to take any questions.
I will start with Jim and then I move over there.
Thanks. Jim Bronston from the Financial Times here in the middle. Mr. Barnier, I know you said that you're still analysing the UK paper, but you also seem to have just ruled out a core part of it because you said that it's not feasible for the whole of the United Kingdom to stay in a customs territory, a joint customs territory with the EU. I mean, doesn't that effectively mean you are ruling out the whole kind of ethos of what the UK is proposing?
Well, what I was saying is clearly set out in all the decisions and the guidelines of the European Council itself. We don't accept an a la carte approach to the single market. The 4 freedoms go hand in hand and are inseparable. As regards this document, I welcome the publication of the document because we need texts on which to work. But being very frank, I think it raises more questions than it provides answers. We, in reading this document, ourselves, a lot of questions spring to mind, additional questions, and I mentioned a number of these already. So in the coming days, on the basis of this document, we will be raising these very questions. I will do so myself with David Davis on Monday morning. I have a meeting early on Monday morning with him, and we will indeed put these very issues to our British office members because we need answers on these. Of course, the point which I've just raised, and I can confirm that, we have presented this exceptional proposal on behalf of the European Union, in other words, to include Northern Ireland in our customs territory. That is quite an exceptional approach, an exceptional offer by the 27, and there are no other comparable examples. And this is a framework that the United Kingdom would be very familiar with because they drew it up and designed it and with us and have been doing so for the last 44 years. And the same applies with the customs union. So on an exceptional basis, therefore, we have wanted to make our contribution to North-South cooperation in Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, and the need to avoid a hard border in Ireland. That is why we made this proposal. I've always said to you, nobody should be surprised that this exceptional proposal and very specific proposal to meet a specific situation, that of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Aside from that, the other point of disagreement, of course, is on the issue of how temporary the backstop would be. Backstop means backstop.
Okay. Eddie's next, and then we move here, and then we come to Tom, and I've already seen a few others that I'm noting down at the same time. Bruno as well, yes. Eddie.
Mr. Barnier, Paddy Smith, Irish Times. Just back immediately to that question of an all-weather backstop, and that is taken by most people to mean that the guarantee that the backstop provides is a permanent one and that will not disappear whether or not an overall deal is done. Are you satisfied by the language in the British paper that this does not provide a time-limited backstop? Is the language of expecting a deal by a particular time sufficient for you to continue discussions on that issue? And secondly, I just want to know if you are looking to June, the June summit, and you're saying that more work has to be done. Is it clear at this stage that the British paper does not actually do the work to establish sufficient progress? It seems that there are so many reservations in what you're saying that it couldn't possibly be regarded as sufficient progress in terms of June.
Firstly, on the British paper, once again, we are reading it very carefully, very objectively, without any ideological preconceptions, with a view to finding practical, operational solutions to an exceptional situation. So, once again, backstop means backstop. Now, why do I say that? Because this has to be a backstop which provides a guarantee under all circumstances. And you will have heard me saying already, no doubt, unless and until. Unless and until we find a solution. That's why the time-limited terminology doesn't work for us. Until, in our future relationship, on which we're going to start working, until we find a better solution, which will meet the goals that we have set ourselves with the UK: no border, maintaining in full the Good Friday Agreement, and maintaining all forms of North-South cooperation. So the temporary backstop is not in line with what we want or what Ireland or Northern Ireland want and need. You ask if I find this discouraging in terms of continuing the discussions. No, not at all. Nothing will discourage me. We have to find a solution for an orderly withdrawal of the United Kingdom, and at the same time limiting the potential harmful consequences of Brexit for Ireland, for the island of Ireland. That's what we're working towards. I'm sorry, I forget your second question. But it was an important question, I know.
June.
Yes, June summit. I didn't use the word sufficient progress as we did as we said in December, because we're not involved in the same exercise. We want to make progress because, of course, June is an important stage in creating the confidence, consolidating the confidence we need for an orderly withdrawal, and in order to ensure that the discussions can continue on what is really the key issue beyond orderly withdrawal. That is our future partnership with the United Kingdom. You will see in the coming days, because we continue working with our British colleagues, we will make progress in terms of moving more articles of this draft treaty into the green, and I'm hopeful that we will make progress on a number of issues where we haven't made progress up to now. I'm talking about separation issues. I mentioned the 3 issues on which we still have a lot of work to do, and 2 on which views clearly diverge. Since you are particularly concerned about the issue of Ireland and Northern Ireland, of course, on this issue, I hope that I will be able to present to the European Council and to Parliament clear progress on a common analysis with our British friends of the type of border controls which we will need. And also along the same lines, as I've been saying, on very specific issues concerning daily life in Ireland, Northern Ireland, goods and agriculture, and so on and so forth, issues on which we will be proposing regulatory alignment. So we're doing already the screening and scoping work for all these points, which you will find in our proposal for the backstop. You can reread that if you like. I would just point out that Theresa May, for whom I have great respect, and I continue to have great respect for her, Theresa May and her team have agreed to the backstop in the March agreement. And there's no question of backtracking on that.
Britain's Foreign Secretary says that President Trump would have done better in these talks, that a meltdown may be coming and that we shouldn't panic. Do you think President Trump would have done better? Is a meltdown coming? Should we panic?
Mieux fait que moi?
Well, you probably know better than I do.
J'ai bien compris.
I understood your point. I'm not going to comment on what the British Foreign Secretary has said. I always listen very attentively to what he says, but it's always very stimulating. But I'm not going to comment on that. What I can say is that being very earnest and calm about this issue, and along with other ministers who raise issues and make proposals, sometimes we're surprised by these, sometimes they may seem rather paradoxical, sometimes you detect an element of nostalgia, perhaps, about belonging to the EU because they want to remain in just about everything without having to respect the regulatory framework. But let's leave nostalgia to one side. One has to assume the consequences. What I can say to, in reply on Boris Johnson, is that we are drawing up our position, taking full account, as objectively, scrupulously and honestly as we can, taking account of the British red lines, those which Boris Johnson and his colleagues have set out, and which have been set out too by the British government. From time to time, well, we respect the British red lines. It would be perhaps good if Britain could also respect its own red lines. And just to be quite clear about this, if these red lines were to evolve on the British side, we would be open straight away. And the European Council itself has said this in its own guidelines. We would be prepared to adjust our position, to reopen or adjust our offer in the light of whatever red lines Britain has. We're working on the basis of the current red lines.
I'm over here. On the future relationship, you talked about an economic partnership and strategic cooperation on security matters. looking at where we stand at the moment in these negotiations, how far have we got? What's going to happen? How are you going to proceed with those negotiations? Obviously, that's a very important question. I want to tell you what I think as a negotiator. This is a very complicated matter. Obviously, we have to look ahead to the future relationship. You've heard me say this before, and other leaders have said this. For example, Angela Merkel. I think she said that the future of Europe is more important than Brexit. And obviously, in the future of Europe, there is a place, in a future Europe, there is a place for a strong economic and strategic relationship with the United Kingdom. So where do we stand? Well, there are no negotiations at the moment, because you can't negotiate with the European Union country. The negotiations will be officially opened on the basis of terms of reference once the United Kingdom has left the European Union institutions on the 30th of March. Obviously, time will be quite limited after that, because we have to look at international agreements and the necessary preparatory work. Main aim is basically to work towards the autumn, October perhaps, I can't tell you exactly when, but by then we will have to have finalised this text, the separation agreement. I hope that'll be the case anyway. That's what I'm working on at the moment. That will then go through the ratification process, and whilst this, or when this is approved by the European Council and when it's submitted to the European Parliament, this will go hand in hand with a political declaration. So that will be in parallel, if you like. That's basically the structure of the negotiations. And I would refer you to what the European Council said in March. There is an offer of an economic partnership on the basis of a free trade agreement, bearing in mind the British red lines. That is still that option of a free trade agreement. And then there would be a second partnership. I called it a strategic partnership on security matters. Obviously, we'd have to draw a distinction between internal security and judicial cooperation and external security and foreign policy. But we're working on our offer internally to take this matter forward. Only this morning I was discussing this with colleagues. So we're working at this at our level, and you'll find all the details of the structure in the guidelines. There are other agreements which will be necessary as well. For example, on aviation, we will need a bilateral agreement because the United Kingdom has decided to leave the single sky as well as the European Union. Another very complex matter. Everything is very complicated here. So we will need specific agreements for that. And in the European Union's toolbox, our toolbox of cooperation with third countries, we're exploring all possible ways of building the best relationship with the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom will be a third country. Subjects such as cooperation between research laboratories, universities, Erasmus. There's a whole raft of third country cooperation tools that we can use to enrich our partnership with the United Kingdom.
If you're still interested, after Catherine, and then I go there, and then we'll see how many questions we still can do.
Catherine Fior, EU reporter. Mr. Barnier, in the joint report of December, there is paragraph 50, where the UK says that it will ensure unfettered access for Northern Ireland's businesses to the UK's internal market. Now, this is a joint UK-EU agreement. What the UK appears to have proposed yesterday is a partial way.
Is Chief Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier. They're welcoming progress from the UK, but crucially rejecting some of the main planks of the UK proposals on backstop, saying the backstop cannot be extended to the whole of the UK. He's also ruling out putting a temporary timeline on that backstop, saying backstop means backstop. We'll bring you more on that after the break.
Now, Theresa May is in Canada ahead of the G7 summit, but back home things are going from bad to worse. The Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has taken a swipe at the PM, saying Donald Trump would do a better job of handling Brexit negotiations. And in Brussels, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator has dismissed Mrs May's backstop proposals for the Irish border as unworkable. For more, we can speak to the Independent's parliamentary sketch writer, Tom Peck, and to City AM's comment editor, Rachel Cunliffe. Tom, Rachel, really good to see you both. Thanks for joining us today. Tom, if I could start with you. Theresa May's had quite a bruising week. How do you think she's got on?
Well, she's got on extremely badly, but none of it's her fault. As you sort of spelled out in your summary, things have gone from bad to worse, but they were always going to. And if you think it's bad now, it's going to get worse and worse and worse over the next 6 months to come. And that is for one reason and one reason only, which is in a few hours' time, we'll be celebrating the year anniversary of that exit poll where she threw away her majority in a quite unprecedented act of political kamikaze suicide. And that is the whirlwind that she's currently reaping, and there is nothing that she can do about it.
Rachel, a tough week for the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think this week it was the anniversary, as Tom just said, of that election when she threw it all away. Really sums up the year that she's had since. Nearly lost one cabinet minister. David Davis almost resigned over, well, over Brexit, but over everything. We've also had another one that she should probably have fired, Boris Johnson, for his comments about how badly everything was going. And in any other circumstances, I think she would have fired a cabinet minister who said that. But of course she can't. And now she's on a plane to Canada to hang out with Donald Trump, who she's meant to be talking to very strictly about tariffs and about national security and about diplomatic relations and all of that. And he's not playing along either.
Tom, over the last few days, all this talk of the backstop plan and whether Davis would stay or would go, and they sort of found a happy medium over the last day or so. And now the EU is saying, hang on a minute, your plans are unworkable anyway.
Well, exactly. There was never a happy medium. I mean, the phrase two bald men fighting over a comb doesn't really do it justice. It's sort of two horrific nut allergy sufferers fighting over a bag of peanuts and who gets to chow into them first. I mean, the whole thing was to time limit the backstop or to not time limit the backstop. Everybody knew that the second there was an agreement, the EU would instantly say this agreement is unacceptable. And actually, the bit of it that they've said is unacceptable is not even the bit they were arguing about. This is to do with the backstop not just applying to Northern Ireland, but applying to the whole of the UK, which is what Theresa May wanted and thought she had agreed. And then Michel Barnier comes out and says no, which he was always going to do. But all of these arguments, the arguments with David Davis, the arguments with Boris Johnson, they're all happening because, as has been the case for 2 years, the British government is sort of going into war with the enemy, marching over the top at high speed. The point of engagement is creeping ever closer, and all they're doing is arguing with one another about how the battle should be fought. Yeah. And the reason for that is because everybody else thinks they're in a position of such great strength because she inflicted this position of such great weakness upon herself.
And Rachel, I mean, just yesterday I was talking to Peter Bone, an arch-Brexiteer, and he was saying the backstop proposals are a stupid idea anyway. I mean, there lies the problem. You know, she's got a lot of juggling to do within her own party.
Within her own party, within Parliament and for the country as a whole. I mean, the Northern Ireland border was always going to be a hot topic issue. We saw that in December where we thought we had a breakthrough and then it turned out that the breakthrough was essentially keeping Northern Ireland in the EU customs union with the UK not being in the customs union, which would obviously create a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Britain, which is not what anyone wants. But again, this was always going to be an issue, and that's why it's really interesting to have that row flare up at the same week that we hear Boris Johnson say, dismiss that and say that's not an issue at all, minimise it, say that there are only a small number of firms that it affects. I think he called it real millennium bug stuff. Well, you know, with the millennium bug, quite a lot of people worked very hard for a number of years to make sure that when 2000 hit, that there weren't sort of collapse and computer breakdown everywhere. And we need to put the work in now to make sure the same thing doesn't happen. And to have Boris Johnson dismissing it as a non-issue is, one, not very helpful, but two, I think shows how we could have seen this coming for years, and it's only coming to a head now, and it's basically hit crisis point.
Tom, on the issue for Boris Johnson, we've got this audio leak, which we've been covering today. If this was 10, 15 years ago, would he have got the sack by now?
Well, if it was 10, 15 years ago, he wouldn't have got the sack by now. He'd have got the sack within about 3 days of getting the job. But what you have is a problem where, if you like, the politics of the way Theresa May appointed her team was politically driven rather than sort of efficacy driven, if you like. And that was a bad decision at the time, and now she's feeling, she's suffering the consequences of that. Boris Johnson has done 10, 15 things that any Prime Minister would sack him for. David Davis has amply shown he is utterly incapable of doing the job that he's been given. But she's now at a point where the reason David Davis can constantly threaten to resign and, to a certain extent, get his own way is because if David Davis goes, then Boris Johnson... I mean, it's been said around Westminster quite a lot recently that if David Davis was to resign, it wouldn't actually matter in some ways, but there would be people like Boris Johnson who wouldn't want David Davis to get all the attention. So she's hamstrung by these people who hold great power over her, even though they are not very good at their jobs. But because of the arithmetic of the situation, which is that if they go, then there's enough Conservatives to challenge a leadership election, and then she's gone, and then you're in a really difficult position. So she is beholden to these people, and they know it. There's no way David Davis would have done what he's done this week, and there's no way Boris Johnson, who I think it's quite credible that he probably leaked those recordings himself, there's no way that would have happened if Theresa May was in a position of strength. And as I've sort of already said, she surrendered that position of strength a year ago today.
Rachel?
I agree with that entirely. I also think that what we've been seeing since the failed election a year ago is a kind of ongoing leadership bid. Now, nobody at the moment desperately wants to be Conservative leader because that means that they have the issue of handling Brexit. What we do know, what we can all guess, is that the second that Brexit has happened in March 2019, there will be a leadership challenge because at that point, whoever the leader is will be able to blame Theresa May for everything that goes wrong in the future. They will be able to blame the Brexit situation on her. And that means that we're currently in the audition process for that. And you've got cabinet ministers left, right and centre who can put forward their own vision of what they would do if they were leader without having the responsibility of actually doing it.
And Rachel, what about the Northern Ireland abortion issue? I mean, is the Prime Minister kicking the can down the road by saying it's a devolved matter, or does she have a point to say that, look, this is actually something for Stormont to resolve?
This is a devolved matter and it is something for Stormont to resolve. However, Stormont hasn't had a parliament since January 2017, actually primarily because of Arlene Foster, who is now, I would say, the second most powerful woman in the UK. The Northern Ireland abortion discrepancy has been something that has been going on for decades, but has really come to light because of that referendum in the Republic of Ireland. And what we've seen over the last week is MPs in Westminster, activists in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland capitalising that and pointing out that, according to a court judgment this week, Northern Ireland's abortion restrictions are incompatible with human rights. They're one of the harshest restrictions anywhere in the developed world. Now, that links into a constitutional issue, and I think Theresa May is right to not try and directly impose that on Northern Ireland. But what's really interesting today is we've got the leader of Sinn Féin, who should arguably be as anti-Westminster as possible, saying, no, we need to do this. The DUP is anti-women's rights, and that they would welcome, very careful wording, but they would welcome Westminster getting rid of the abortion restrictions in order to give rights to women in Northern Ireland. You could never have expected that. Yeah, Tom, a final thought from you?
Yeah, it never rains, it pours, does it, for Theresa May? And on the abortion question, you need momentum in politics, and she does have a perfectly acceptable case, which is that this is a matter for Stormont. But as has been said, Stormont is not sitting. But where you are is you're in the DUP's position on abortion is as ridiculous as their position on Brexit. They won't countenance any difference between the UK, the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland, except they will fight very hard to maintain that difference on the issue of abortion. And on Brexit, they won't have any difference, but they won't allow any difference between the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland, but they also won't countenance a hard border. Those positions are completely irreconcilable. They hold both of them simultaneously, but Theresa May is in hock to these people, and there's nothing she can do about it.
Very interesting. Tom, Rachel, good to see you both. Thanks for your time. Have a good weekend.
Thank you very much. You too.
Thank you.
Although the row that is thought to have pushed the Brexit Secretary David Davis close to resigning this week was put into perspective today when Europe's top Brexit negotiator cast doubt on both his and the Prime Minister's visions for the Northern Ireland border. Michel Barnier insisted any backup plan to keep Northern Ireland's border open, known as the backstop, could not be time limited. And he borrowed one of Theresa May's stock phrases to make his point, saying backstop means backstop.
Just yesterday, the Commission here in Brussels received a British proposal that, in the words of Theresa May, was a choice between the unacceptable and the unpalatable. Today, it rapidly became clear that her hard-won compromise on how long a so-called backstop agreement should last had one flaw. London is meant to be negotiating with this man, not each other. Michel Barnier made it brutally clear that an EU offer to allow Northern Ireland to effectively stay in the customs union if necessary is not an offer they've made to the whole of the UK.
The UK is taking a different angle, however. It is looking for a UK-wide solution. Let me clear, very clear, our backstop cannot be extended to the whole UK. Why? Because it had been designed for the specific situation of Northern Ireland.
All of which is clearly making people like Boris Johnson wonder whether a deal's going to be possible at all.
Britain's Foreign Secretary says that President Trump would have done better in these talks, that a meltdown may be coming and that we shouldn't panic. Do you think President Trump would have done better? Is a meltdown coming? Should we panic?
La seule chose que je peux dire à Boris Johnson, c'est que
what I can say to in reply on Boris Johnson is that we are drawing up our position, taking full account of the British red lines, those which Boris Johnson and his colleagues have set out. Well, we respect the British red lines. It would be perhaps good if Britain could also respect its own red lines.
One red line, number 10, said tonight it won't be breaking, is allowing a customs border to be put between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK.
have a nice weekend too, huh?
There is something of a pattern developing here at each stage, London adopting, willingly or unwillingly, positions that will keep us very closely aligned to Brussels. That's why Brexiters like Boris Johnson are getting frustrated, and why it looks increasingly as if we're either going to end up with a big bust-up and no deal, or something that looks and feels very like continued membership of the single market and customs union. James Mates, News at 10, Brussels.